So with these presentations, the idea is to look at a variety of different aspects of the research process and the interaction between that and decision making. So it could look at theory or methods or research findings and even management implications. And I think you'll see a little bit of all four of these aspects in today's presentation. So the series is sponsored by the Department of Journalism and Technical Communication at CSU, the National Park Service, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the U.S. Forest Service, as well as the U.S. Geological Survey. So as I said in the beginning, watch for upcoming announcements for further seminars. But today, what we're talking about is the Wildfire Research Team. This is infusing social science into wildfire education programs through collaboration and systematic data collection. So we're going to have a series of 5 presenters, and I'll start with here in the room, we have Patty Champ, who's a research economist at the U.S. Forest Service Rocky Mountain Research Station. And over the past 10 years, she has developed a research agenda focusing on 3 aspects of wildfire. There's the effects of wildfire risk on home sales prices, the wildland-urban interface, homeowners' perceptions of risk and risk mitigating behaviors, and the economics costs of exposure to wildfire smoke. We also have Hannah Brinkert-Smith, who's an environmental sociologist at the University of Colorado's Institute of Behavioral Science. Hannah's work examines social environmental interactions in the face of environmental change, particularly in the American West. In the past 10 years, Hannah's work has focused primarily on household and community responses to wildfire risk. And then calling in today on the phone, we have Chris Barth, who's a wildfire mitigation specialist for the Bureau of Land Management in Southwest Colorado. Chris has worked with the public and stakeholders to promote fire education and mitigation strategies, as well as led several regional wildfire and environmental coalitions. His research interests include public perceptions of wildfire risk, homeowners' attitudes towards wildfire mitigation, and communities' adaptation to wildfire. And we have Lilia Falk also on the phone. Lilia is the director of the West Region Wildfire Council. Lilia joined the council in 2011 and has focused her efforts since then on working with partners across the region and the state to leverage resources that promote fire adaptation activities and education. And last and least, my name is James Meldrum. I'm a research economist with the USGS Fort Collins Science Center in the Social and Economic Analysis branch. My research broadly encompasses decisions about natural resources and hazards with a focus on ecosystem services. I've been very lucky to be a part of this wildfire research group since late 2012, which is 4 years ago now. So with the introductions out of the way, just real quick about the format of the seminar. Often these seminars will work with each presenter going and then followed by questions. But because all of our parts are tightly entwined and we've worked very closely on this project throughout, not just the presentation, but all the project, we plan to run straight through for about 1 hour. And then we'll have time for discussion and questions as a group after that. So please interject if clarification is needed, but we'll plan on start taking questions and discussion around 4 p.m. And so for those of you who are on the webinar or using the phone, you should be in listen-only mode, so we can't hear you there. So please use the chat if you have a question, and we're monitoring that in this room. And if there's clarification questions, we can address them as they come. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to our first speaker, who is Chris Barth, and he's coming at us remotely.
All right, so I'll go ahead and begin here. Again, hello everyone, my name is Chris Barth. This afternoon I'm going to provide some background on the wildfire problem and the impetus for our research collaboration. As was mentioned in the intro, I'm a fire mitigation specialist for the BLM and have 24 years of experience in fire management. Fire management is becoming increasingly complex. This is in part due to an increase in the population living in the wildland-urban interface. Go ahead, the next one. While the number of acres burned and fire suppression costs fluctuate annually, there's an upward trend in both. Go ahead and hit next. And obviously there are significant costs other than suppression. To date, this year, 51,676 fires have burned just over 5 million acres, and this is just under, but on par for the 10-year average. The wildland-urban interface is the area where homes meet or intermingle with undeveloped wildland vegetation. Several reports suggest that there will be a significant increase in the development in the WUI in the next 15 years. In Colorado, there are approximately 1 million homes in the WUI, But what is more concerning is that about 41 to 60% of all homes in Colorado are in the WUI. So wildfire research, or WiRe, is an interdisciplinary research collaboration focused on homeowner wildfire risk mitigation and community fire adaptiveness. Several of the members of our team have been working together for more than 10 years. Around 2002, several of us attended a workshop that emphasized the importance of narrowing the knowledge transfer gap among researchers and practitioners. To that end, we feel that a cornerstone of our collaboration is a commitment to applied research that yields more effective and efficient programs aimed to reduce wildfire risk and increase community adaptation to fire in the WUI. As you can see, our work covers a significant portion of the state over the last 10 years. While our process has evolved over time, much of the data is consistent, which allows comparisons across geography, demographics, and time. Our current projects are largely concentrated in southwest Colorado. We will highlight some of the results of those efforts here today. West Region Wildfire Council works to mitigate the loss due to wildfire in wildland-urban interface communities in Delta, Gunnison, Hinsdale, Montrose, WiRē, and San Miguel counties. You'll hear more from Lilia Falk, Director of West Region Wildfire Council, later in the presentation. Firewise of Southwest Colorado uses an ambassador model to keep lives, homes, and property from being damaged by wildfire in Archuleta, Dolores, La Plata, Montezuma, and San Juan counties. As you saw on the previous map, we have plans to begin working with Grand County Wildfire Council next year, as well as potentially other wildfire councils throughout the state in coordination with Fire Adapted Colorado, or FACO. Those living in the WUI can choose to take or not take action to reduce their wildfire risk and become more fire adaptive. These research efforts are vital to understand the actual views of the individuals and communities living in the WUI. Practitioners, like West Region Wildfire Council, adapt their programs based on the research efforts to be more effective and efficient in encouraging action from these WUI residents. The end result is a fire-prone community that is more prepared and resilient when a wildfire occurs. Before I turn it over to James to share more about our data collection efforts and some of the findings from those efforts, I'll leave you with the URL for our blog down on the bottom right of this slide, where you can find links to most of our team's publications. Thank you. I'll turn it over to you, James.
All right, so now I'm going to go through a section where we're talking about the data collection efforts. And as I'm doing this, I'm going to be describing both the main sources of data for the project, but also how they drive some of the motivation and the logic for this overall approach. So some of the main findings that have fed into that. So the cornerstone of our approach really is this paired assessment and survey that's administered in selected communities. And what you can see on the map here are places where data has been collected. These are parcels in southwest Colorado. So it's covering a fair amount of area, and it covers a lot of the area where the regional wildfire councils that Chris was just describing are. And a really important aspect of our research is that the data is actually being collected and administered by the practitioner side of our team. And there's a common theme you'll hear throughout this presentation, that the practitioners and the researchers are working very closely and communicating closely, and we think that strengthens all of our efforts going through. So you can see that there is, and I just got a notice there, so I'll hold this closer to my mouth, and I will try to speak more slowly. Thank you for the feedback, though. So as you can see, the data collection has gone in a variety of different places, and I'm now going to focus on the rapid assessment and the household survey as the two main data types. So first, the rapid assessment. This involves practitioners actually going out and looking at properties. So they'll drive through communities and look at a number of factors that describe basically the combination of the probability of wildfire on a property, which is basically the chance of a fire in the area that will reach that property, and then the consequences if that happens, so the chance of the house actually burning down. So there are 4 sets of factors. There's 11 characteristics grouped into 4 factors. So the first describes kind of a background risk, and these generally describe the way that fire would be moving through the landscape, things like topography, slope, vegetative fuels in the area. The next set of categories describe defensible space. And defensible space is important for 2 main reasons, and those are that, on the one hand, they describe kind of the bridge from fire in the general area into the structure. So there's kind of this standalone value of defensible space. But then there's also the question of defensible space making it easier and safer for suppression crews to protect the house if they indeed are going to try to protect that house. The third category looks at structural aspects. So these are things like roofing material, building materials, decks, fencing. And then the fourth looks at different aspects that will control the access and the accessibility for firefighters and suppression crews. And as you can see on the slide, each of these is assigned a point total. And these point totals can be used to add together into an adjective overall rating. So this is the overall rating running from low to extreme fire risk. And the important thing to note here is that this is a rating that is going to be assigned by the professional, but it's not a subjective rating. It's based on the weighted sum of these specific factors that are being measured. And so if you look at the results of this in 3 of the counties that have been assessed, you can see that on both of these slides, over to the left is lower risk, going to the right is getting to higher risk. And as you can see, generally, many people have been rated at the very high or even extreme risk levels for their properties. Again, this is using those same 11 categories that we just saw. And at the same time, most of these people actually have minimal defensible space. So recommendations, they depend slightly on property, but they're usually 100 to 150 feet. And most people are actually below that. So there's not very much defensible space there. But the practitioners are interested in understanding more than just the looks of the property, but really the underlying decision-making and all the different social factors that go into that. And so this is what motivates them pairing with household surveys. And so to date, household surveys have been administered in these 6 counties. And as you can see, we're getting pretty nice response rates, and particularly some of these communities up to 62%. And the important thing to note is that these surveys are going to all assessed properties. And all properties within a community are, okay, I just got a warning that I'm going in and out. Sorry, I don't know if there's much I can do about that. I will, again, try to speak more slowly. So the response rates range from 30% to 60%. And we really feel like this is quite representative of these communities. And so these surveys look at a variety of different aspects. And they look at things ranging from experience with wildfire, knowledge of wildfire risk, attitudes about wildfire, social interactions, information sources, incentives and barriers regarding mitigation, risk attitudes, as well as, of course, demographics and housing characteristics. So all these different factors are being measured in addition to the characteristics of what the property actually looks like. So one of the important aspects is that these surveys not only ask all those other questions, but they ask the specific 11 items that the assessor is measuring. And as you can see, when you put people's responses about their own property against what the professional said about their very own property, that's what we're seeing here. And we see that the 2 distributions do not match up very well. They follow the same general trend, but people tend to overall rate their overall risk lower than the professional does. And it's important to note that this isn't happening just with that adjective rating, but it's also happening on a lot of individual attributes. So the defensible space example that I show here, a lot of people are saying that they have more defensible space than what the professional assessed their properties as. So this really motivates one of the key aspects, which is a paired assessment approach of, again, linking these assessments with the surveys. But of course, we want to do more than just see what the properties look like. We want to understand the decision-making behind that. So one of the things that surveys look at is stated reasons that people say they are not mitigating these fuels, because we know that the mitigation is not happening to the level that's being recommended. And the main thing that jumps out with this slide is that no single barrier really stands out. The most common answers are happening about 30% of the population is saying these things. But that said, the things that are most important to people are they claim they need specific information about what to do. Not just the fact that they're at risk of wildfire, but specifically what can they do on their property to reduce their risk. So that specific information is really important. And then the other one, of course, financial costs can be prohibitive to people, and that's a perceived barrier. But it's also important to note that other anecdotes that we often hear, such as people being unwilling to remove trees, or they might not think that mitigation is effective, or even that it's the government's responsibility, not theirs, these things really aren't coming up very frequently in these surveys. So they don't seem to be primary barriers that we need to be trying to overcome. But another important theme throughout a lot of our research, based on the findings that we're seeing, is that many of the variables that we measure look different when you look across different communities. They vary significantly. So what we're seeing here is measures for different county level, different county level aggregates of these different measures. And this variation only increases if you look at a finer detail of scale. So if you move from the county to, say, a small community oriented around a HOA or something like that, the different answers become more and more varied. And so this motivates what are really important aspects of our research, and that's engaging with individual communities and having continual ongoing efforts, not just looking at one project and extrapolating from there to a broad region, because these variations do seem to be very important. And so one final point that I'd like to bring up is that whenever we give these talks, someone usually brings up insurance, and they claim, or they seem to be implying, that it might be a silver bullet of a way to influence behavior. And one of the main findings coming out of these surveys, or a common finding coming out of these surveys, is that most people really don't know much about their insurance. You know, we see that a few people have lost their coverage, a few people are required to mitigate based on terms of their insurance company, but these things are not very widespread. So this graph here shows 82% in the Delta County surveys knew of no effect. That's not saying there wasn't an effect, but they didn't know about it. And it's important to note that these results have held pretty constant across time and locations. So this chart here just shows a variety of different surveys implemented asking similar types of questions. And it hovers from 70 to 95% of the population, or the sample, is saying that they do not know of this link between insurance and wildfire. And then one final point related to that is that even those who do know of this link, they don't appear to be doing any sort of different behavior on their property. And so that's the last line on this picture, is that vegetation cleared to 30 feet. And that's that really important defensible space measure. And there is no significant difference between the different groups. So even those who are aware of the signal from this from the insurance companies don't appear to be acting differently. And so with that, I'd like to hand it over to Hannah.
Great, thank you. Can you hear me just so we can check the volume? I know it's been having problems. Okay, no responses so far. Okay, it's low. Okay, hi, can you hear me better now? This is great. Okay, so what I'm going to talk about today is our contributions to the wildfire research literature, and that's going to form hopefully a segue till when Lilia is going to talk a little bit about how our research is helping to inform wildfire education programs. And what's really important about what I'm going to present, because it's just going to be a really high-level smattering of our big research findings, is that our research really demonstrates this basic assumption of our research team, and that's that wildfire mitigation outcomes, the behavioral outcomes of residents, are really the product of multiple social processes that are interacting. And so when I talk about the findings from our papers, those individual papers are attempts to really dive into each of those processes and explain them a little bit more in a more detailed manner. And so while we present them separately here, they really are all part of a larger picture. So the first paper I'm going to talk about is really focuses on cost-shared mitigation. And so in many hazard contexts, there are cost-sharing programs. And what these are public dollars that go towards private citizens so that they can take action. So their actions can be, the cost of the actions can be defrayed a bit so that they can reduce the risk on their property. Ultimately, the goal, of course, is to reduce public expenditures for disaster-related losses. Now, there are programs like this across the wildland-urban interface. About half of them focus on subsidizing fuels. And the focus really is on vegetative fuels. And the reason that they tend to be on vegetative fuels rather than structural fuels is really has to do with the history of fire management and forest management across the American West. And so those dollars have tended to come from land management agencies. And we see a focus then on thinning trees, removal of trees, and so forth. And so our question has been, what is the role of the availability of a cost share program on a private property owner's decision to mitigate their risk? And so we had in the survey, there's a question that asks whether or not respondents would participate in a cost share program up to $1,000 per acre to remove vegetation. And if they're willing to pay, if they're willing to participate, how much of that $1,000 would they be willing to pay? And what we see from our survey data is that by and large, the majority of our respondents are willing to participate in such a program, 84%. On average, they're willing to pay about $400 per acre. We see that income and age and property size all affect willingness to pay. So we see older and wealthier participants willing to pay more. And we see that as property sizes increase, participants are actually indicate that they're willing to pay less. So they're sensitive to the overall costs of their parcel if their parcel is larger. And we see also that participation is not related to concerns about whether or not mitigation would change how their property would look. We see that there's more willingness to participate if respondents perceive that they're facing a higher wildfire risk, but we see less participation among those who have a higher assessed risk. So this is the pairing of that household survey data and then that parcel assessment data that James described. So we see that incentive programs are likely quite useful, but they may not motivate those who have the highest risk on their parcels. So they may be a tool among a whole quiver of tools. So we know that property owners are situated on their parcels, and we want to think about their risk. We also want to think what's happening on the parcels next to them. So we want to talk about spatial spillovers. So we all experience spatial spillovers on our own properties, whether or not we live in the wild and urban interface. We all have neighbors who make our properties more safe or friendly or valuable. And we also have neighbors who make our properties less safe and less friendly and less valuable. So in the wildfire context, we talk about spatial spillovers in terms of interdependent risk. So the conditions on one parcel, on your neighboring parcel, affect your risk. And likewise, the decisions by your neighbor affect the decisions that you might make or even the decisions that are available to you. So the question we have is, how do our survey respondents react to the conditions on their neighboring properties? And what we see by looking at the parcel level assessment data is that residents who have defensible space, good defensible space that's cleared of heavy vegetation, tend to live next to, near, adjacent other property owners who have good defensible space. And likewise, we see that those who have heavy fuels within that 30-foot perimeter of the home, which a firefighter needs to be in to protect a home, they tend to have heavy fuels. So we see birds of a feather tend to flock together. Now, when we add our survey data into this, we're able to gain a little bit more insight. So we see that respondents who report that their neighbors have dense vegetation, they have higher fire risk perceptions. And one might be led to think that they're taking action, but that is not actually what we see. We see that respondents who report that their neighbors have dense vegetation also tend to have dense vegetation on their own properties. So maybe some people are just oriented towards risk differently. Maybe different people have different risk preferences and engage in risky behavior in different ways. So we ask about risk preferences. We want to know if there are some people who are just living in these areas who are more willing to take on risks. And so we use a simple survey question that asks about whether or not people are willing to tolerate risks. And we see, and this is for Delta and San Miguel County, we see that about a third of our survey respondents identify as being not very willing to take risks. So we would characterize them as being risk averse. And the survey also asks about willingness to tolerate risks in other domains, not just a general measure, but we also ask about driving a car, financial matters, sports and leisure, career decisions, health choices. And in the most recent surveys that are were recently conducted by FireWise of Southwest Colorado. There was a question added about willingness to lose your home to wildfire, which we have yet to look at, but should prove to be interesting. So what we see is those who would be characterized as risk-averse do not view the probability of a wildfire any differently from people who are identified as risk-neutral or risk-taking. So the risk perceptions are not measurably different. We do, however, see that risk-averse respondents think that the negative consequences of a fire, if a fire were to occur, are less likely on their property. And what we can see with the partial data is that the partial assessments actually demonstrate that the risk-averse respondents have lower parcel level wildfire risk. Now, we can't tell you from these data whether or not they've all self-selected into a lower risk property or they've all done the work needed to reduce their risk, but we can see that there's a relationship there that deserves further investigations. So if they're not all doing things, we wonder if we can nudge them to do things. So nudges is a part of, comes out of behavioral economics, and nudges are small messages that are intended to motivate or encourage specific behavioral outcomes. We see them a lot in utility bills these days. I don't know if you've noticed in yours, you may see a comparison between your water use and your neighbor's water use. These are nudges, and what they're trying to do is encourage you towards water conservation, for example. So West Region Wildfire Council recently undertook a nudge experiment to see if they could use specific messaging to encourage some specific wildfire-related behavioral outcomes. So they sent letters signed by the local fire chief to all the assessed properties in a selected community. And the letter is on the slide, and it indicates a lot of information, including, and so there were three sets of treatments, 3 types of letters went out. The first set of letters included just the community wildfire risk, so the community level wildfire risk, so a collective level. The second group of respondents received the community level wildfire risk plus specific information about that person's property's risk level, because they've all been assessed. And then the third treatment, the third set of letters included 3 sets of information: community level risk, the recipient's property risk, and then also a measure of the average of the 10 closest neighbors' wildfire risk. And then there was, in the letter, there's a specific call out. We want you to do any of these 3 things. We want you to visit a parcel-specific website that shows you all the details of your property, contact the West Region Wildfire Council, or attend a meeting that was being announced in the letter. And we're going to talk a little bit about the results of that in a minute. So the last piece I want to talk about in terms of the papers that we have out in publication or under review is on fire adaptation. So Chris, at the beginning of the presentation, spoke briefly about fire adaptation. There have been efforts underway to promote adaptation to wildfire and to develop fire-adapted communities. And Chris provided a great definition of that. It's out in the literature to some extent. But what we wanted to know was, what does it mean? What does adaptation mean to key stakeholders who are working on fire issues? And what do they characterize as being the qualities of a fire-adapted community? And so we conducted interviews with key players in the fire-adapted communities effort at the national level. We didn't want to just know what they were putting out in promotional materials, but really what this meant to them and how they understood the processes required to move towards fire adaptation. We also conducted interviews with regional leadership in Southwest Colorado. So these are multi-county type of fire education programs. And then we also conducted interviews with local leadership. So these are neighborhood leaders, fire chiefs, folks who are really working on the ground with communities and with residents. And our key findings are that there's evidence of shared understanding of what it means to adapt to wildfire across all these organizational levels. Now, this is true even among neighborhood leaders who had never actually heard of the term fire adaptation. But they were able to think through their understanding of wildfire and come up with a definition of fire adaptation that was very, very similar to what was coming out of the interviews with the national leadership. So there's something intuitive about this concept that folks who are not engaged in the concept formally are able to plug into. We also, though, see that there's mixed investment in kind of the central tenets of adaptation, and that risk reduction approach, a hazard model, is still very dominant at the implementation end. So the folks, those neighborhood leaders, those fire chiefs are still very much thinking about a risk reduction model, thinking about short-term risk reduction, immediate results type approach, rather than this longer, multi-sectoral, multi-scalar approach that's being promoted at the national level. And in that way, adaptation was not consistently seen as applicable to all contexts. And so indeed there's evidence that there are gaps in translation between what the conceptual conversation of what it means to adapt to wildfire and the implementation. And we really see those gaps as these opportunities for communication and coordination across the organizational levels who have a hand at dealing with the wildfire issue. And a second paper that will be coming out of these data really begins to tackle the key role that regional level stakeholders play at translating across those organizational scales. And so a key stakeholder at the regional scale would be Lilia Falk, who will be talking in our next section. Lilia, are you there?
Hi, everybody. I'm Lilia Falk. I'm the director of the West Region Wildfire Council. Could somebody just confirm in the chat box that you guys can hear me okay? That would be great. Okay, good deal. So this afternoon, I will be sharing information about how our programs utilize the research findings. So today, I want to highlight the benefits of our researcher-practitioner partnership. The research that is done in our area provides insight and data into the populations we serve and gives us information for how we can adapt our outreach and programs to better reach our residents. I'm going to highlight 2 communities today that will provide context to how research-driven data has actually changed anecdote-based assumptions at the community leadership level and guided the conversation towards better understanding of our stakeholders and their residents or constituents. I'll also demonstrate how the research has actually helped to shape our programs and resources that we offer to residents in our area. So how does the research help change the conversation? The first change in conversation I want to highlight is from data driven from the town of Mountain Village, where a few more than 700 homes were assessed for wildfire risk and also concurrently sent our survey tool. 41% of Mountain Village homeowners responded to the survey. For those of you that don't know, Mountain Village is a fairly high alpine, spruce-fir-dominated resort community. Most of the homes are second homes, and a large majority are built with wood-shake roofs. Thus, a brief description of our wildfire risk issue in this community. A few interesting results from the survey helped us facilitate some informative discussion related to Mountain Village constituents. So for example, whereas Town and Mountain Village leadership was under the impression that people moved to the community for the trees and that they weren't willing to cut trees to reduce wildfire risk, 77% of our respondents disagreed with that statement and conversely responded that they are actually willing to cut trees to reduce wildfire risk. So if they're willing to cut trees, what's stopping them? The survey actually also asked about perceived barriers. So the town of Mountain Village actually has some pretty strict policies on cutting trees, requiring a permit that has to be issued for tree removal. 46% of the owners who responded viewed that as a top barrier as to why they haven't removed trees around their home, as indicated in the graph to the right there. As a town that actively promotes the creation of defensible space, that information gave town officials some insight as to how they might better integrate their permitting process and their defensible space incentive program to help break down these barriers. So, in addition to asking about barriers, we also conversely asked about motivators. So Hannah earlier spoke to cost share motivators, but in addition, the survey questions that ask about motivating factors for completing wildfire mitigation also came back with some affirming results for programs that the West Region Wildfire Council already has in place, as in our parcel level risk assessment. 77% of the respondents in Mountain Village said that specific information about what needs to be done to reduce wildfire risk would actually encourage them to take action. And building off of what we already heard earlier in terms of the amount cost shared, we know that financial assistance does help encourage action, and that there is what I like to call a sweet spot for how much cost share is offered, which actually became our organization's target for our cost share program that we offer to our homeowners. So that actually starts to shift our conversation today into how we use the data to inform and evolve our programs on the ground. So this is a new community focus. What you're seeing here is a Google Earth map with the results from the parcel level risk assessment overlaid in the Cedar Edge, Colorado area. The Cedar Edge community could best be summarized as a working class and retirement community. Cedar Edge is situated at the base of Grand Mesa and is mostly comprised of pinyon juniper woodlands where agricultural clearing hasn't taken place. There's a vast difference in lot or land ownership sizes, as you can see from the different colored parcels there. In Delta County, we assessed a few over 1,900 homes for wildfire risk, and again, sent the survey at the state or concurrently with our efforts. As was already shown, but just as a reminder, we did have 58% survey response rate in Delta County. And just to highlight some of the results from Delta County, similar to Mountain Village, 75% of Delta County respondents said that they would be willing to remove trees to reduce wildfire risk, and not quite as high as Mountain Village, but 54% of respondents said that specific information about what they should do to reduce risk would encourage them to take action. So one critical part of the evolution and growth of any organization is the awareness and the ability to sort of step back and assess your effectiveness. For us, that was a light bulb moment, and our light bulb moment was basically focused around just how much rich information we were sitting on. I've shown you two communities here, and as you may have already inferred from the area where our research has in the past and is being done and is going to be done in the future, we have parcel level data beyond just these two places. Basically, we have about 5,600 homes that have been assessed for wildfire risk. But the realization was, were we really doing the greatest job at getting that information in the hands of homeowners? The answer was no. We're a staff of 3 and cover 6 counties, so we needed to come up with a solution. I guess I would just say that it was sort of serendipitous, but the timing of our realization that we really needed to get this information into the hands of homeowners and the launch of the WiRe team newest project using nudges, as Hannah just explained, really brought us the ability, or should I say the ability, to harness a certain team member's web programming skills, James, to launch individualized risk assessment websites for our homeowners. What you're looking at here is our risk assessment landing pad on our website, so that's cowildfire.org/myhome. And Hannah also talked a little bit about this, but the next step for us was to get people to actually go to their website and learn about their risk. So as part of our overall nudge research project, we sent homeowners those individualized letters that included a unique code that would allow them to access their personalized risk rating webpage. This letter was designed as a tool for our nudge research, but it also provided us, the West Region Wildfire Council, the perfect outlet for disseminating the website information. So for the interest of what we're talking about here, the red box in the lower third of the letter has a unique code that can be used on that landing pad. So what you're seeing here is a sample website, and you can actually visit the web page if you go to cowildfire.org/myhome and enter the test 01 code. It will take you to a sample. I encourage you all to do that. But to give you some details about the page while we're talking here today, the page does give us some basic information about the background of the risk assessment. It geolocates the address using Google Maps and then highlights how their home was assessed in each of the 11 categories that James spoke to earlier. The photos on the website are dynamic and they change with the rating information, as do the arrows. So for us, I'll just say it's working. If the goal from our organization's standpoint is to provide education to homeowners about wildfire risk and then to generate interest and mitigation activity, then the research is certainly helping us do that. Since we launched these websites late this summer, we've had a significant increase in our participation in our mitigation programs in Delta County, specifically in Cedar Edge, which was the first community that we targeted. The results are preliminary, and we are still collecting data. Every day we get folks to sign into their individual website. Hannah is going to share a little bit of those preliminary results with you. But in conclusion, before I hand this back off to Hannah, from a practitioner standpoint, the research work and the findings help us to better reach our communities. They improve our programs, and they help inform our conversations with stakeholders, civic leaders, practitioners, and homeowners. And if I had to leave my 2 cents for any other practitioners that are listening in here today, my advice would be get a research team. Thanks. Hannah?
I think so. I've got one slide to preview a little bit of what Lilia was saying. And so the mailing to Cedar Edge was sent out in August. We have a graph on the left side here that you can clearly see when that letter hit mailboxes in Cedar Edge. And then a follow-up letter was sent in October, beginning of October, and you can see again another bump in visits to the website, the West Region Wildfire website. And so what we're seeing is that there is definitely some response in terms of the letters that are being sent. We have about 161 total responses. 16% of those who received letters responded. And what we're also seeing is that there are significant differences between our treatment groups. So I described the treatment A was getting community level information. Treatment B was receiving your community level wildfire risk and your personal wildfire risk rating. And treatment C was receiving those 2 bits of information along with a comparison to your neighbors. And what we see is that groups A and C have the biggest response compared to group B, and it is a statistically significant difference. And so we kind of are, at this point in our preliminary analysis, we're gleaning 2 things. One, making contact matters. So we've seen this huge upsurge of people going to the website, which is great for West Region Wildfire Council to be able to get out the information, not only about the individual parcel level ratings, but also about the work that they're doing, but also that the content of the message matters, and that hopefully with the work between that we're doing together, we can help refine and identify which types of messages, whether it's a teaser message that indicates that there's some information now and some information if you take action and go to the website, or because you receive information about yourself in comparison to your neighbors, that different kinds of messages matter. And we hope to continue to refine those messages to create the best kind of outreach possible. And so now I'm going to turn this over to Patty Champ, who's going to talk about the future of our team.
Thanks. So I'm on cleanup here. So before I kind of get into the future of WiRE, that's what we call our group for wildfire research, there's kind of 2 points that we wanted to communicate here, and hopefully we did, and hopefully with my cleanup slides I'll communicate those as well. One is kind of the nature of the research and the way we do things, but it's also about the nature of this collaboration, and that's really difficult for us to communicate how we work together. But just the way, Lilia so graciously kind of promoted that everyone should get involved with some researchers, and likewise for us, it just really makes our day that she's using our work. So hopefully we've kind of communicated those aspects, but I wanted to mention that before I finish up. So where are we going? We want to continue to expand our perspective. So as Hannah kind of brought up when she was talking about the various papers that we've worked on to date, our unit analysis kind of started with the homeowner, and we said, okay, we have this person and we know what their property looks like, and we think it's related to some of the characteristics of the human that occupies that parcel, and we focused on that for a while. Then we said, well, this person has neighbors, and they might be looking over their fence or across the way at what their neighbor's doing, so we looked at that piece with the spatial spillover effect. Then we got a joint fire science grant a few years ago to kind of add in the community piece. Well, this person lives on this property and they have these neighbors, but they also live in this community, and this community has certain characteristics and programs and those pieces. Then we also have 2 wildfire councils, and I think that was in Chris' part of the presentation, where he said those 2 councils that we've looked at, West Region Wildfire Council and Firewise Southwest Colorado, they have somewhat different programs, and now we can tease out kind of differences between those 2. But when we think about it, we're kind of moving our way up. Now we really want to look at the broader landscape. So who else lives near, what else surrounds these communities? And that's to look at kind of cross-boundary issues. So if you're proximate to a national forest or a national park or some BLM land, how does that affect your decisions that are made on private land, and kind of these cross-boundary effects? And we'd like to do that. We're writing a proposal right now to get some additional money to look at Grand County, which is a perfect place for those of you who are from Colorado. You might be thinking about that, kind of that encompasses Winter Park and that area, and it includes, Rocky Mountain National Park, the Forest Service. There's some Colorado State Forest Service land up there. So we're going to look at that place. What we'd also like to do, though, is re-examine an active community. So in 2012, with Lilia's help through West Region Wildfire Council, we had taken this approach in this community of Log Hill Mesa. So now we're 4 years out. It's a very active community. A lot's been happening. We want to see if there's been social changes as well as biophysical changes in that community over time. And we'll be able to make some comparisons then between the communities we look at in Grand County and Log Hill Mesa, as well as, of course, all the other areas we've looked at. Is the arrow key? Oh, okay. So the other thing we want to do is when we started this process, the way these rapid assessments, which we didn't get into too much, but the way they were done was that somebody, like at the West Region Wildfire Council would go out and, from the street or maybe on the property, look at a car and check off things on a piece of paper. Then they'd go back to the office with their piece of paper and enter that data into some kind of Excel file or something. So fortunately, one of the folks on our team is Pam Fromke, who can work magic with Access databases. So she did automate this for us. So then we had drop-down menus, and we got tablets, and so the assessments could be done using, better technology. But there's still a lot of issues with that. We want to be able to integrate a lot of different kinds of data. We want to have all of that available. So if Lilia goes on a homeowner's property, she can kind of see, what the rapid assessment said and all these pieces and add on to that data. So we want to create an app. And there are certainly, for those of you in the wildfire community, there are folks using apps already, but